In our previous lessons we explored the work of Wilhelm Wundt, the founder of experimental psychology. Today we pause to consider his most influential, and, at the same time, his most unfaithful, disciple. Edward Bradford Titchener was a Briton trained at Leipzig who built his career at Cornell University in the United States. There he founded a school he christened with a name now famous, psychological structuralism. Titchener presented himself as Wundt's loyal heir, but in reality he transformed his legacy so profoundly that the master would scarcely have recognized it. He eliminated apperception, creative synthesis, and psychic causality. He kept the experimental method and introspection, but drove them to an extreme Wundt would never have accepted. His goal was to dissect the mind into its simplest elements, just as an anatomist dissects a body. Today we shall examine his proposal, his reasons, and the controversies that surrounded it. The question Edward Titchener posed at the end of the 19th century was as ambitious in its statement as it was rigorous in its method. What is the ultimate structure of the mind? Can conscious experience be broken down into its simplest elements, just as chemistry breaks a compound down into its atoms? Titchener believed it could, and he devoted his entire life to building a psychology that would be, above all, an anatomy of consciousness. The problem had two faces. The first was methodological. What tool allows access to the elements of consciousness without distorting them? Titchener answered, introspection, but not the casual introspection of someone musing in an armchair. Systematic introspection, practiced by subjects trained over months. The second phase was theoretical. What are those elements? Titchener proposed three: sensations, images, and feelings. Everything we experience, however complex it may seem, reduces to combinations of these three types of components. In making this proposal, Titchener departed from Wundt in a decisive way. He kept the laboratory and introspection, but abandoned apperception, creative synthesis, and psychic causality. For him, the mind was not a unifying activity. It was a structure that could be dissected. For studying Titchener we have at our disposal a published body of work that is itself a testimony to his obsession with rigor. The work that gave him worldwide fame was the 4 volumes of experimental psychology, published between 1901 and 1905. Known as Titchener's Laboratory Manuals, these books became the Bible of experimental method for an entire generation of American psychologists. In 1908 appeared his Psychology of Feeling and Attention, a monograph in which he developed in detail his theory of feelings as ultimate elements of consciousness. But his mature work was a textbook of psychology, published in 2 volumes in 1909 and 1910. In its pages he set out the definitive classification of the elements of consciousness: sensations, images, and feelings. Everything we experience, Titchener held, can be broken down into these 3 types of ultimate components. His books mirror his personality: meticulous, exhaustive, perfectionist. Every step of an experiment is described with almost obsessive detail. From his laboratory at Cornell, Titchener supervised dozens of doctoral theses and turned his department into the most productive in American psychology at the turn of the 20th century. Edward Titchener arrived at Cornell University in 1892, aged 25, with a doctorate freshly obtained at Leipzig under the supervision of Wilhelm Wundt. British by birth, trained at Oxford and Leipzig, Titchener was a cultural transplant, a European carrying German experimental psychology to the New World. At Cornell he would remain until his death in 1927, turning his laboratory into the most productive in the United States and training over 50 doctoral students, among them Margaret Floy Washburn, the first woman to earn a doctorate in psychology. Titchener always presented himself as Wundt's loyal disciple. He translated Wundt's principles of physiological psychology into English and disseminated the experimental method throughout the English-speaking world. But what Titchener taught as Wundtian was, in reality, a profoundly transformed version of his master's thought. He eliminated apperception, creative synthesis, and psychic causality. He reduced psychology to the study of the mind's structure and armed it with a method Wundt would never have fully accepted: systematic introspection trained over months. In 1898 he coined the term structuralism to designate his approach, in opposition to William James's functionalism. In 1904 he founded the Society of Experimental Psychologists, an all-male group that met in his laboratory to discuss research in a rigorous and, by all accounts, often intimidating atmosphere. Where did this approach come from? The most obvious influence is Wundt, but a Wundt filtered and simplified. Titchener took from Leipzig the laboratory, the experimental method, and introspection, but stripped them of their original theoretical framework. Another crucial influence, though less visible, is British associationism. Titchener was educated at Oxford reading Locke, Hume, and the Mills. From them he inherited the idea that the mind is a combination of simple elements that associate with one another. That idea, combined with German experimental rigor, produced structuralism. Finally, Titchener took from chemistry his guiding metaphor. Just as water breaks down into hydrogen and oxygen, consciousness must be capable of being broken down into its ultimate elements. Psychology was for him neither a science of the soul nor a science of behavior. It was, literally, an anatomy of the mind. We have reached the theoretical core of Titchener's project. In his textbook of psychology of 1909 we find the definition that guided his entire work. The first task of psychology is to discover the ultimate elements of consciousness, to determine their number and their properties, and to formulate the laws of their combination. This sentence, seemingly technical, contains an extraordinary ambition. Titchener was not content to describe the mind. He wanted to break it down into its most elementary pieces, just as a chemist breaks down a compound into its atoms. What exactly does this definition mean? It means, in the first place, that the object of psychology is the structure of the mind. Not its function, that would be the business of functionalism, not its evolution, that would be the business of developmental psychology, not its anomalies, that would be the business of psychopathology. Only the elements that compose it and the laws that govern their assembly. And in the second place, it means that the method for accessing those elements is introspection. But not just any introspection. Titchener's subjects had to be trained for months, sometimes for years, to avoid what he called the stimulus error, the natural tendency to describe the perceived object rather than the pure experience. If someone showed an apple to an untrained subject, they would say, "I see an apple." That was the stimulus error. The trained subject had to say, "I see a circular shape, red with yellowish nuances, with a smooth and shiny texture." Only thus could one access the true elements of consciousness. And what were those elements? Titchener proposed three. The first, sensations, the basic components of perception. He identified over 44,000 distinct sensory qualities, classified by modality, visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, and by dimension, quality, intensity, duration, clarity. The second, images, faded versions of sensations that appear in the absence of the stimulus. When we recall a face or imagine a melody, we are experiencing images. The third, feelings, the affective components of experience. Titchener proposed that feelings were organized along three dimensions: pleasure, displeasure, tension, relaxation, and excitement, calm. Behind this entire proposal lay a guiding metaphor: chemistry. Titchener conceived psychology as an anatomy of the mind. Just as water breaks down into hydrogen and oxygen, consciousness must be capable of being broken down into sensations, images, and feelings. The psychologist's task is that of the chemist of the mind, to isolate the elements, to catalog them, and to discover the laws that govern their combinations. In embracing this metaphor, Titchener departed definitively from Wundt. For Wundt, the mind was a unifying activity. Apperception organized experience, creative synthesis produced wholes that were more than the sum of their parts. For Titchener, the mind was a structure. And structures do not create. They are dissected. Titchener did not merely declare that psychology should study the structure of the mind. Like any rigorous thinker, he offered reasons to support his proposal. Those arguments were not merely technical. They reflected a complete conception of what it means to do science. Let us examine the three main grounds that articulate his structuralism. The first ground is Titchener's most celebrated and most characteristic. Ordinary introspection, he observed, systematically commits an error. It describes objects, not experiences. If I ask someone what they see and they answer, "I see an apple," they are not doing psychology. They are doing physics. Because apple is a concept that belongs to the world of external objects, not to that of immediate experience. True psychological introspection must purify its language. The trained subject does not say, "I see an apple." They say, "I see a roughly spherical shape, red with greenish nuances, with bright reflections on the surface and a slight sensation of coolness to the touch. Only thus does one access the elements of consciousness. Titchener was convinced that psychology would not advance so long as it confused the perceived object with the experience of perceiving it. The first task was to clear away that error. The second ground appeals to a principle Titchener took from the natural sciences: anatomy precedes physiology. Before asking how an organ functions, one must know how it is built. Before asking what the mind is for, as William James's functionalism did, or how it develops, as evolutionary psychology would do, one must know what elements compose it. Structure is logically prior to function. Structuralism was not, for Titchener, just one more school. It was the necessary foundation of all scientific psychology. What he pejoratively called functional psychology was, in his judgment, a premature discipline that claimed to explain the workings of something that had not yet been described. The third ground is the deepest and reveals the conception of science that underlies Titchener's entire project. Chemistry, he recalled, had been a descriptive discipline for centuries. Alchemists mixed substances and observed what happened, but they did not understand what happened. Chemistry became a science when Lavoisier and his successors stopped describing compounds and began breaking them down into elements. Water ceased to be a mysterious substance and became a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. Mendeleev's periodic table revealed an underlying order in the diversity of substances. Psychology, Titchener argued, had to travel the same path. Before studying the mind's complex functions, memory, reasoning, emotion, one had to isolate the simple elements that compose them. Science advances by analyzing, not by synthesizing. Titchener's structuralist proposal was no academic exercise without consequences. It transformed the practice of American psychology, provoked debates that divided the scientific community, and finally led to its own decline. Let us examine the four main consequences of his thought. The first consequence was methodological. Systematic introspection demanded subjects trained for months, sometimes for years, to avoid the stimulus error. This drastically limited the number of possible investigations. Structuralist psychology became a discipline for specialists, practiced in a handful of laboratories by researchers trained at Cornell. Its results were difficult to replicate and its method almost impossible to teach outside the circle of initiates. The second consequence was theoretical. By defining psychology as the study of the structure of normal adult consciousness, Titchener excluded from the psychological field children who could not practice trained introspection, animals who could not report on their experience, the mentally ill whose consciousness was altered, and unconscious processes, which by definition are not accessible to introspection. Psychology was thus confined to an extremely narrow slice of human experience. The third consequence was the most celebrated controversy of Titchener's career. Oswald Kulpe, a former pupil of Wundt who had founded his own laboratory at Würzburg, claimed that imageless thought existed. His subjects, trained in introspection, reported experiencing conscious states, such as doubt, certainty, or sudden understanding, that contained no sensory image whatsoever. Titchener reacted with an outright denial. For him, all thought contained images. What Kulpe's subjects described was not pure thought, but defective introspection. The controversy divided the psychological community for years. And although it was never fully resolved, the balance gradually tipped in Kulpe's favor. The existence of imageless thought gained acceptance, and the structuralist edifice began to crack. The fourth consequence was decline. Structuralism as a school died with Titchener in 1927. He left no disciples to carry on his program. James's functionalism, Watson's behaviorism, and Gestalt psychology took center stage. But Titchener's legacy did not vanish entirely. His insistence on methodological rigor, on controlled observation, and on precise language for describing experience left a lasting mark on experimental psychology. The stimulus error, though differently formulated today, remains a relevant concept in consciousness research. Titchener lost every battle, but some of his weapons are still in use. Titchener's structuralism left open questions that still generate debate among historians of psychology. The first and most persistent concerns his method. Was introspection an objective tool or a form of indoctrination? Titchener's Cornell subjects produced results that were strikingly consistent with one another, yet different from those obtained in other laboratories. Did those results reflect the actual structure of consciousness, or merely the fact that they had all been trained by the same person to describe their experience in a particular way? The second question is the imageless thought controversy. Do conscious states exist that contain no sensory component whatsoever? Kulpe and his disciples said yes. Titchener said no. The data from both sides were irreconcilable. The third question is historical. Was Titchener a faithful disciple of Wundt or an unwitting betrayer? He always presented himself as the master's legitimate heir, yet he suppressed the central concepts of his psychology. Finally, there is the question of the viability of the structuralist program. The fact that it died with its founder, leaving no disciples to carry it on, suggests that perhaps structuralism was not an autonomous scientific program, but an enterprise bound up with Titchener's charisma, authority, and implacable personality. The figure of Titchener has drawn sharply contrasting interpretations from historians of psychology. Edwin Boring, his most celebrated pupil and first biographer, presented him as the great systematizer of experimental psychology. In his monumental History of Experimental Psychology of 1929, Boring defended Titchener as Wundt's faithful heir and his structuralism as the culmination of the scientific program launched at Leipzig. Robert Evans, in an influential 1972 study, challenged this picture. Titchener was no mere transmitter of Wundt's thought. He transformed it so profoundly that he created an entirely new psychology. By eliminating apperception and creative synthesis, by reducing the mind to a structure of elements, Titchener departed so far from Wundt that his psychology, Evans argued, was already fully American. Kurt Danziger went further still. For him, Titchener marks the moment psychology isolates itself socially. His insistence on purified introspection, accessible only to subjects trained for months, pushed psychology away from real human problems and turned it into a socially irrelevant laboratory exercise. 3 readings, 3 Titcheners: the loyal disciple, the unwitting innovator, and the isolationist. We have reached the end of our lesson on Edward B. Titchener. 3 points deserve to be held onto. The first is his conception of psychology as an anatomy of consciousness. Titchener was not content to describe the mind. He wanted to dissect it, to break it down into its simplest elements. Those elements were 3: sensations, images, and feelings. Everything we experience, however complex it may seem, is nothing more than a combination of those ultimate components. Psychology was, for him, the chemistry of the mind. The second point is the stimulus error, perhaps his most enduring concept. Ordinary introspection describes objects, not experiences. Saying, "I see an apple," is doing physics, not psychology. To access pure consciousness, Titchener trained his subjects for months. They had to learn to describe colors, shapes, and textures without naming the object that provoked them. This demand for linguistic purification, extreme as it may seem to us today, left a lasting mark on consciousness research. The third point is his relationship with Wundt. Titchener always presented himself as the loyal disciple, but he transformed his master's legacy so profoundly that he created a new psychology. He eliminated apperception, creative synthesis, and psychic causality. He reduced the mind to a structure of combinable elements. The structuralism he taught at Cornell was no longer the psychology of Leipzig. It was a fully American psychology. That is why we close with this thought. Titchener wanted to be the chemist of the mind. And although his laboratory closed with him, his demand for rigor and precision remains one of the hallmarks of scientific psychology. For those wishing to pursue Titchener and psychological structuralism further, several works are indispensable. The primary sources are Titchener's own manuals, the 4 volumes of experimental psychology, and his textbook of psychology, where he set out the definitive classification of the elements of consciousness. As for secondary literature, the classic History of Experimental Psychology by Edwin Boring, his most celebrated pupil, remains an unavoidable reference. Robert Evans, in his influential 1972 article, questioned Titchener's fidelity to Wundt's legacy. And Kurt Danziger, in Constructing the Subject, offered the most incisive critique of structuralism's social isolation. In our next psychology lesson we shall enter the thought of Franz Brentano, the philosopher and psychologist who reintroduced the concept of intentionality into contemporary philosophy and whose act psychology opened the path toward Husserl's phenomenology. We hope you will join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.